Alright, Push Scholars, Mr. Beamer here with another video. We're going to do chapters 31 through 33 test review. And this test is going to cover two main topics: the Progressive era from 1900 to 1920, and also World War I era, 1914 to about 1918. Alright, here are the three chapters that we will cover. Chapter 31 is the Progressivism and the Republican Teddy Roosevelt. So this chapter is about TR's policies and also William Howard Taft's policies when his presidency for 4 years. Chapter 32 is going to be about Woodrow Wilson, his progressive ideas, especially at home. And also the last half of chapter 32 touches on events around the world, his moral diplomacy, problems with Mexico, and the beginning of World War I. And the final chapter is World War I, the war to end war, which of course it did not do. And this is the United States entering into the war with 1917, and the fighting actually stops in November of 1918, but the final treaty doesn't get hammered out until 1920, called the Treaty of Versailles. That's never ratified by the United States. Okay, so here's some key topics for Chapter 31 about the Progressive Movement and Teddy Roosevelt's presidency. So the first thing I want to mention is the progressives and the use of government. So, of course, before the Progressive Movement, it was the era of the Gilded Age, and we know that the government was very laissez-faire, the government was very hands-off, but the progressives come around and they want the government to become more involved. They want to use the government to make society better, to end the corruption, and to help all Americans. So the government should be used to help make America better. Our key topic is the muckrakers, and we'll talk about some of the three big muckrakers when we get down to this point. But the muckrakers, again, they were investigative reporters. They investigated problems in America, and they tried to report them and expose the corruption to the public. The second part of that is, who were the progressives? Well, the progressives were middle-class Americans. Now, there wasn't a very big middle class in America during the early 1900s, but these middle-class people were kind of saw the problems that the poor had in America, and they also had problems with the wealthy and the big gap between the rich and poor. So middle-class Americans formed a lot of these progressive ideas, trying to end the corruption and the problems and the inequalities in America and try to help the poor. Also, an important note is that the progressives were in both political parties. So there was Republican progressives and also Democrat progressives. So Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican and he was a progressive, and Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat and he was a progressive. And there were progressives at the federal level, of course, with those presidents, but also at the state level and local levels saw a bunch of progressives. The most progressive state probably during this era was probably Wisconsin. So we know that progressives wanted to reform America, make it better. And one of the goals was by trying to give more power to the people. And the three ways they did that was by having the people create new laws and be able to vote on it through the initiative. The referendum also was an important way to give more power to the people, where the people could actually vote on a law. And then, of course, the recall is the third part of the power of the people, where citizens, if they're unhappy with their elected officials, they can get enough signatures and they can remove them via the ballot box. So if there's a bad official, they can issue a recall and vote on whether they want to remove that bad official. All right, Teddy Roosevelt, president for 8 years, of course, took over in 1901 with the death of McKinley when he was assassinated. And his domestic policy was the square deal. Of course, that meant he was going to be fair to everybody. And that slogan came out of the 1902 Pennsylvania miners' strike. And we know that Teddy was going to be fair to all sides. One of the things he did is he said that he was going to replace the striking workers with federal troops if they did not get back to work. But he also said that he was going to send the strike to arbitration and have a judge or a third-party rule on what to give the workers. And in the end, the deal was fair to everybody. According to Teddy Roosevelt, that's how he got his square deal policy, and that's the slogan for his domestic progressive policy, being fair to everybody. And the three C's that he wanted to change in America is he wanted to have more control over the corporations. He wanted to protect the consumer, especially when I think of like the food that they were eating. And the third C is conservation. That's probably his greatest legacy as president. Okay, they called Teddy Roosevelt the trust regulator. Actually, his real nickname was probably the trust buster, but we know that's not really true because Teddy Roosevelt did not break up all the trusts. He actually let some trusts stay. For example, U.S. Steel, which was owned by J.P. Morgan when TR was president, was allowed to stay because TR said that U.S. Steel was not hurting the consumer at all. So he basically regulated the trusts. The bad trusts he would break up. The good trusts he would let stay as long as they weren't hurting the people. So he was Teddy the trust regulator. All right, his legacy as president, one of the things TR did was he brought more power and fame to the presidency, mostly because of his outgoing personality. Now, there's always a big debate. What is his biggest legacy? Is it the Panama Canal or conservation? And according to our author, and this is a little test hint for you, David Kennedy, the author of the textbook, The American Pageant, said TR's greatest legacy is his conservation and protecting of the national parks and resources. All right, getting back to the muckrakers, the big three you need to know. Upton Sinclair, The Jungle, 1906. He exposed the terrible working conditions in the factories in Chicago. Of course, he also exposed the terrible things being put in the sausage that people were eating. Second book, Lincoln Steffens, 1904, The Shame of the Cities, exposed the corruption of the political machines in New York City. So it helped end the political corruption in the cities. And the third book, just as important, is Ida Tarbell's book, The History of Standard Oil in 1904. And this book exposed the corruption in the ways of Standard Oil Company, and it helped lead to the downfall of Standard Oil in 1911 when the Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil must break up because it was a monopoly. All right, next, Booker T and W.E.B. We've talked about them before when we had the discussion questions about them. I just wanted you to have a little context here that W.E.B. really becomes well known in the early 1900s, around 1909, 1910 is when he founds the NAACP, and he really becomes more of a prominent, important person in the African American community. And of course, the biggest difference is that Booker T. Washington wanted to get economic equality. He was accommodationist, where W.E.B. Du Bois wanted change now. He wanted to use political and social means to end the inequality now. All right, almost done with chapter 31. A couple more things. We know that TR's foreign policy, this is more from the previous couple of chapters, is about big stick diplomacy. Speak softly, carry a big stick. Taft's foreign policy was a bit different. It was called dollar diplomacy, and Taft wanted to use economic ways to influence Latin America. Instead of threatening them with our military all the time, he said we are going to use American dollars there. We're going to invest in these countries, and they'll be more supportive to our ideas. However, eventually Taft somewhat abandons dollar diplomacy, and he does start to send troops to certain countries to influence them that way. All right, the final topic of chapter 31 is the conflict between TR and Taft heading into 1912. We know that TR and Taft were like best buds. In 1908, TR personally recommended Taft to become the successor in the 1908 election, and Taft does win. However, Taft's presidency starts to annoy TR. One of the causes is the Ballinger-Pinchot affair, where Taft fired Pinchot, who was one of TR's buddies, and he fired him for doing too much progressivism, too much conservation. So this made TR mad at Taft. Also, Taft broke up U.S. Steel, which is something TR did not want to see happen. So in the end, TR and Taft start to really have problems going into 1912. Taft is becoming less progressive heading into the 1912 election. This is making TR mad. So TR is going to try to win the Republican nomination in the 1912 election and steal it from Taft. But he does not succeed. All right, we're moving on to chapter 32, Woodrow Wilson's Progressivism at Home and Abroad. So really Wilson's first term as president. He was a two-termer. He won the 1912 and 1916 election. All right, one of the most important elections in APUSH is the election of 1912, And we know that Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, win. And most of us know that Wilson won because the Republicans split their vote. Half the Republicans voted for Taft and half voted for Teddy Roosevelt. Okay, and before I get back to that, the idea that did win out was the idea of progressivism. 1912 was probably the height of the progressive movement, or in this time period. And because Teddy Roosevelt did not get the Republican vote, he thought he would get it, but eventually Taft gets the Republican vote. And so, once Taft becomes a Republican nominee, TR starts to form a third party called the Bull Moose Party, also called the Progressive Party. So this shows that the progressives did win out because basically all three presidents to some degree were progressives. So if TR did not run for president, Taft most likely would have won and been a two-term Republican president. But TR split the vote because he used to be a Republican, so some of his Republican friends stuck with him. The other ones voted for Taft. So Wilson wins. And so when he takes over, he is quite a progressive, a militant progressive, and he criticizes the triple wall of privilege in America. He said the triple wall includes the trusts, higher tariffs, and the banking system. These three things make up the triple wall. So he helps laws get passed to break down the triple wall of privilege. So the first one, the laws, an agency that breaks up trust monopolies, is the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914. That's a must know. Clayton Antitrust Act just gave teeth to the Sherman Act of 1890, so trusts were now broken up. And the government agency that promoted the breakup of trusts and monopolies was the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. Their job was to investigate potential trusts and monopolies and break them up. The second part of the triple wall of privilege was the higher tariffs, and Wilson, as a Democrat, wanted to lower tariffs, and he dramatically lowers tariffs with the Underwood Tariff of 1913. The federal government now is going to get less money because of the lowering of the tariff, but eventually that is replaced with the 16th Amendment, the graduated income tax. That's the main source of federal revenue after the Underwood Tariff. And the final part of the triple wall of privilege that Wilson helps break down is a new government agency to regulate banking in America, and that's called the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve System still is around today, 100 years later, led by the wonderful Janet Yellen. It used to be run by the chairperson, Ben Bernanke. And one of the goals of the Federal Reserve System is to regulate currency in America, and if needed, can issue more paper money and can cause inflation to help get the economy going again. So the Federal Reserve System is the third part to regulate the banking system in America. All right, a couple things about Wilson's personality that are on the test that you may need to know. One is he was quite a racist president. Despite being a progressive, he did support segregation in the White House. Also, he was very stubborn. Okay, he was very inflexible, not much of a compromiser, and this stubbornness is going to hurt him, especially at the end of World War I when he tries to negotiate a final treaty to end the war. So that's his personality. His foreign policy, compared to TR and Taft, we know that Teddy Roosevelt, was big stick diplomacy. Taft was dour diplomacy. Woodrow Wilson is moral diplomacy. Moral diplomacy is basically doing what you think is right. And so he was less of an imperialist, you could say, than the other two. However, despite believing in moral diplomacy, Woodrow Wilson does send some troops in Latin America to quell some problems in there in places such as Haiti and the Dominican Republic. But Woodrow Wilson's biggest foreign policy headache before World War I is problems with Mexico. And so Mexico is going through a revolution in the early 1910s, and one of the new leaders was threatening to nationalize oil in Mexico. And that's a problem for America, especially American businessmen who have oil interests down there, and so this is not good for the United States. Problems with Mexico become even worse for Wilson when another Mexican named Pancho Villa, who was kind of an outlaw bandit, killed some Americans in Mexico. And then Pancho Villa actually invaded the United States and went into New Mexico and killed 19 Americans there. And so now this is a serious problem for Woodrow Wilson. He's got the Mexican Civil War. taking American oil reserves, and now this guy named Pancho Villa. So Wilson sends a famous American general, Black Jack John Pershing, to go down into Mexico and find Pancho Villa. So he does actually invade Mexico to try to find him. He never does find Pancho Villa. And eventually, a year later, we are dragged into World War II in Europe. And so we kind of leave Mexico alone, never able to capture Pancho Villa. All right, for the test, you do need to know the major sides and countries for each. So we got the Allies versus the Central Powers. The Allies, France, Great Britain, and Russia. The Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, are the main countries that you need to know for the test. So for the first 3 years of World War I, we are a neutral country. We trade with both sides, both the Allies and the Central Powers, but 90% of all our trade is going to the Allies during the first 3 years of war. The United States becomes actually quite wealthy with this trade and kind of booms our economy. And then finally, Wilson is up for re-election in the 1960 election, and he does win. He barely wins. And 3 reasons why he does win is because his campaign slogan is "He kept us out of war," which is true. We were still neutral in 1916. He promised peace and continued progressivism, and the economy was booming, partly because of all the trade we were getting from World War I with the European countries. Okay, the final chapter, chapter 33 for this test, The War to End War, is about World War I and the United States involvement. So the first thing you need to know are some of the causes of the U.S. entry into World War I, April 6, 1917. One of the biggest causes was German unrestricted submarine warfare. The Germans announced they were going to sink any ship around the British Isles, so any neutral ships could be sunk by the German submarines or U-boats. And of course, that included American ships. And so by them announcing this, it made America quite unhappy. Another reason is a Zimmerman note. Germany sent a note to Mexico asking them to go to war with the United States. That made us mad. Woodrow Wilson's famous saying, "To make the world safe for democracy," is another reason why we entered World War I. Also, the Russian Revolution is probably a fourth reason why we entered World War I. Partly because they no longer had an autocratic leader. The Tsar is no longer in charge of Russia in 1917, so we can enter the side of the Allies without being aligned with an autocrat. So towards the end of the war, Woodrow Wilson wanted to be the savior of the war and have the final peace treaty, and he wanted this to be his 14 points. He had 14 ideas to keep the world safe for democracy in the future. I would definitely know many of the points: self-determination, end of secret alliances, reduction of arms, end of imperialism, freedom of the seas, free trade. But the most important of his points was the creation of the League of Nations. League of Nations was an organization made up of most countries that would try to prevent future war and to help each other out. The idea was called collective security. Okay, collective security is trying to help each other out to prevent future war. I wanted to mention this: when the Germans announced unrestricted submarine warfare, the United States does not go to war yet. Woodrow Wilson basically broke off relations with them, did not talk to the Germans after they announced this, but we do not declare war until the Zimmerman note is found in April of 1917. Okay, most Americans became soldiers in World War I through the draft, through the Selective Service Act. Not many of them were actually volunteers. This is very unlike the Civil War. The Civil War, most soldiers were volunteers, although there was a draft. If you remember the Civil War, you actually could get out of the draft if you owned 20 slaves in the South. And in the United States, if you could pay a certain amount of money, then you would not have to fight in the war. Of course, this did not happen in World War I with the draft. So there was no way to buy your way out of getting caught up for the draft of World War I. Also wanted to mention most of the soldiers fought very little in World War I. Most of the Americans, we didn't get there until 1918, the last year of the war, and we really were not in very high combat areas during World War I. Some African Americans did join the war effort in World War I, partly because they wanted to show other Americans that they loved this country and that they did not believe in segregation. And you need to know that most African Americans did not fight in the war. They were in non-combat duties, mostly in segregated units as well. So they were in all-black regiments, and many of them did not see much combat. They were in non-combat duties, so maybe a cook, maybe an aide to a doctor. All right, you must know about the Great Migration of World War I in the 1920s, and this is the migration of African Americans from the South heading towards the North and West. Most of the migration went to major cities such as Cleveland, Chicago, and Detroit, and they settled in the cities, did these African Americans. Why were they coming north? One reason was to get the jobs, find jobs in the factories. Unfortunately, that did cause more racial tensions, and there's a lot of race riots in the North. The most famous one is probably Chicago race riots of 1919. All these African Americans coming up from the South potentially could take jobs away from the striking workers. Also, African Americans were leaving the South to get away from the Jim Crow laws that were continuing to exist in the South. All right, World War I, the government involvement in the economy was rather minimal. The government's main role was to try to encourage volunteerism from companies, from businesses. They would encourage them to make war goods to help out the effort. They would encourage Americans to ration their resources. The government did not get too involved in the economy. However, during World War II, 25 years later, the government basically takes over the economy to help win the war against the Nazis and the Japanese. The rest of Chapter 33 is of the end of the war and the Paris Peace Conference and the Treaty of Versailles. And this maybe is the most important thing of the chapter in a push. And so you need to know after the war in 1919, the Paris Peace Conference is held, and countries of the world send representatives to discuss a peace to end World War I. Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, actually goes to this peace conference, which was kind of unusual. And unfortunately for Woodrow Wilson, as a Democrat, he did not bring any Republicans with him to the peace conference, so a lot of the Republicans did not like Woodrow Wilson. So Woodrow Wilson basically promotes the Treaty of Versailles, and much of the ideas in the treaty are his 14 points. However, Wilson did have to make major compromises to the Allies for them to accept the treaty. So basically the Allies, especially France and Great Britain, wanted to punish Germany, and they do. And so they basically ground Germany down to nothing. They make the Germans pay reparations. Germany had to pay $33 billion to the Allies, and so they basically wanted to punish and hurt Germany, which is what they did. And Woodrow Wilson had to accept this because he wanted France and Great Britain to approve of his League of Nations, which they eventually do. So the League of Nations becomes Article 10 of the Treaty of Versailles. And so I would definitely know Article 10, that's Roman numeral 10. Basically, that is giving the provision for the League of Nations. And the Republicans back in the United States did not want the League of Nations. They wanted to remain very isolationist. So they did not want to support this article, and thus were very against the Treaty of Versailles. So the Republicans are broken down into two groups. The reservationists and the irreconcilables. The irreconcilables, led by Bora and Johnson, wanted nothing to do with the Treaty of Versailles. They were against it completely, so they wanted Americans to not even think about it. The other group of Republicans is called the reservationists, and they were led by Henry Cabot Lodge, Republican, who basically said he will accept the treaty if they made 14 reservations or changes to it. Now, of course, this insulted Woodrow Wilson. Him and Lodge absolutely hated each other, and so there was this huge conflict going on in 1919 and 1920 whether the United States Senate was going to approve the Treaty of Versailles. So in order to get the treaty passed, Woodrow Wilson actually tours the country. He goes all over the country giving speeches trying to promote his Treaty of Versailles. He wants the American people to put pressure on the Republican senators to make them vote in favor of the treaty. So Woodrow Wilson, as he's going around the country, on his way back, he's in Denver, Colorado, and he suffers a stroke. In his last year and a half of office, he's never the same mentally again, and really he struggled with exhaustion and collapse there. And maybe because of the stroke, Woodrow Wilson actually told his Democrats to not vote for the Treaty of Versailles. This is a little bit confusing, but the treaty that was up for vote in the Senate was the Treaty of Versailles with the 14 reservations that Lodge put forth. So Woodrow Wilson basically told his Democrats to not vote for that treaty, and they don't, and so they listened to him. So our author of our textbook, David Kennedy, he blames Woodrow Wilson for the failure of the Treaty of Versailles not being passed in the United States because Woodrow Wilson in 1920 told his Democrats to not vote for the treaty with the reservations. So then to summarize, the United States basically creates the Treaty of Versailles with Woodrow Wilson in charge. And the United States is the only country that ever signs the Treaty of Versailles. And so we had to make separate treaties with Germany and Austria-Hungary to officially end the war. The League of Nations does happen, but the United States never joins the League of Nations, which makes it really weak, which ultimately helps lead or allow Hitler to rise to power in Germany because the League of Nations never tried to stop him without the United States. All right, fire up, A-Push scholars. Good luck on the test. Fire up.